The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered porch where Samuel Hayes sat with his coffee growing cold in his hands. He had been watching the horizon for nearly an hour, though he couldn't say exactly what he was looking for. The ranch stretched out before him quiet except for the gentle lowing of cattle in the distance and the creak of the old windmill that had been turning in the same rhythm for 30 years. At 62, Samuel had lived on this land for most of his adult life. He had inherited it from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. The Hayes family had worked this soil and tended these animals through good seasons and lean ones through times of plenty, and times when every penny counted. Samuel knew every fence post, every water hole, every shade tree on his 1,000 acres. The loneliness hadn't always been there. In the early years there had been Martha, his young wife, with her bright laugh and her way of making even the hardest days feel manageable. She had filled the old farmhouse with the smell of fresh bread and the sound of humming while she worked in her garden. But that was 25 years ago now. Martha had been gone almost as long as they had been married. Taken by a swift illness that left Samuel stunned and uncertain how to continue. Their son David had tried to convince him to sell the ranch after Martha passed. "Come to Denver, Dad," he would say during his occasional visits. "You don't need to be out here, all alone." But Samuel couldn't imagine leaving. The land was part of him now, woven into his bones and his daily rhythms. He knew which pastures needed rest, and which ones could handle another month of grazing. He understood the moods of his cattle, and could predict weather better than any meteorologist. Still, the quiet had grown heavier over the years. The conversations he held were mostly with his animals, or with the few neighbors who stopped by occasionally. Samuel had grown comfortable with solitude, but lately he found himself wondering if comfortable was the same thing as content on. This particular morning his meditation was interrupted by a sound that didn't belong. A weak cry that seemed to come from somewhere near the old barn. Samuel set down his coffee cup and listened carefully. There it was again, faint, but definitely human. He stood up slowly, his knees protesting after the long sit, and walked toward the sound. The barn was one of the oldest structures on the property, built by his grandfather back in the 1940s. Samuel didn't use it much anymore, preferring the newer metal building closer to the house. But he kept it maintained out of respect for family history, and because it provided good shelter for equipment he didn't use regularly. As he approached the barn, the crying became clearer. It was a woman's voice, and she sounded frightened. Samuel quickened his pace despite his arthritic joints. When he reached the heavy wooden doors, he could hear her more distinctly. "Please," came the voice, muffled but urgent. "I can't breathe in here. Someone please help me." Samuel's hand went immediately to the door handle, but then he paused. Something wasn't right. The voice was coming from inside, but he knew he had locked the barn 3 days ago when he had stored some old fencing materials inside. How had someone gotten in? And why would they be trapped? "Ma'am," he called through the door. "Are you hurt? Can you tell me what happened?" "The rope," came the reply, weak and shaky. "I'm tied up. Please help me, I can't get loose." Samuel felt his heart rate increase. This wasn't just someone who had wandered onto his property and gotten locked in accidentally. This was something else entirely. He thought about going back to the house to get his rifle, or at least to call the sheriff. But the desperation in the woman's voice made him hesitate. She sounded genuinely terrified. With careful movements, Samuel unlatched the heavy wooden beam that secured the barn doors. The old hinges groaned as he pulled one door open just wide enough to peer inside. The interior was dim, lit only by the sunlight filtering through gaps in the old wooden slats. There in the far corner, he could make out a figure. A young woman, maybe, 30 years old, with long dark hair that had fallen across her face. She was sitting on the dirt floor, her hands clearly bound behind her back. Her clothes were simple and dusty, a light-colored dress that had seen better days. Even in the poor light, Samuel could see that she had been crying. "Oh, thank God," she said when she saw him. "Please help me. I don't know how I got here. I woke up and I was tied up and locked in." Samuel stepped into the barn but kept his distance. He had lived long, enough to know that situations like this were rarely as simple as they appeared. The woman looked genuinely distressed, but how had she gotten onto his property and into his locked barn? "What's your name, miss?" he asked gently. "Ruth," she replied. "Ruth Morgan. I think I was driving and my car broke down. I remember walking looking for help, but then everything gets fuzzy. I must have hit my head or something." Samuel looked around the barn carefully. He didn't see any signs of a struggle or any indication of how she might have gotten inside. The doors had definitely been locked from the outside, which meant someone else had been involved. But who? And why would they leave her here on his property? "Ruth, I'm going to help you, but I need you to tell me the truth. Do you remember anything else about how you got here?" She shook her head, tears starting fresh. "I'm so scared. I just want to go home. I have a little girl. She'll be worried about me." The mention of a child made Samuel's chest tighten. He thought of his own son and how frantic he would have been if Martha had disappeared when David was young. Without further hesitation, he approached Ruth and knelt down beside her. "Let me see these ropes," he said. The bindings were professional tight, but not cutting off circulation. Whoever had done this knew what they were doing. Samuel pulled out his pocket knife, a tool he had carried for 40 years, and carefully cut through the rope. The woman's hands were free in moments. Ruth rubbed her wrists gratefully and looked up at Samuel with eyes full of tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." Samuel helped her to her feet and guided her toward the barn door. "Let's get you to the house and we'll call the sheriff. They need to know about this." As they walked slowly across the yard, Samuel found himself studying Ruth more carefully. She was younger than he had first thought, maybe mid-20s, with delicate features and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in every detail of her surroundings. When they reached the porch, she paused and looked back toward the barn. "I still don't understand how I got there," she said. "It's like pieces of my memory are just gone." Samuel opened the front door and gestured for her to enter. The house felt different with another person inside. The rooms that had been silent for so long suddenly seemed more alive, more purposeful. Ruth stood uncertainly in the living room, taking in the simple furniture, the photographs on the mantel, a sense of a life lived quietly but with dignity. "Sit down," Samuel said, indicating the couch that had been Martha's favorite spot. "I'll get you some water and we'll figure this out." In the kitchen, Samuel found his hands shaking slightly as he filled a glass. This was the most unusual thing that had happened on his ranch in decades. He couldn't decide whether to be suspicious or sympathetic. The woman seemed genuinely confused and frightened, but the circumstances were so strange. When he returned to the living room, Ruth was looking at a photograph on the side table. It showed Samuel and Martha on their wedding day, both of them young and beaming at the camera. "Your wife," Ruth asked softly, "was she passed away many years ago?" "I'm sorry, she looks like she was very happy." Samuel handed Ruth the water and sat down in his usual chair across from the couch. We both were for the time we had." Ruth sipped the water and seemed to relax slightly. "You live here alone." "I do. My son keeps trying to convince me to move to the city, but this is home. You know how it is when a place becomes part of you." Something in Ruth's expression changed. She looked around the room again, but this time with a different kind of attention. "Yes," she said quietly. "I do know." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments. Samuel found himself studying Ruth's face. There was something familiar about her, though he couldn't place what it was. She had the kind of features that reminded him of someone, but the memory remained just out of reach. "Ruth," he said finally, "before we call the sheriff, I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." She looked up at him, her eyes wide. "Of course. Is there anyone who might want to hurt you? Anyone who would have reason to tie you up and leave you somewhere?" Ruth was quiet for a long time. She set down the water glass and folded her hands in her lap. "I think so," she said finally. "I think there might be." Samuel waited, letting her take her time. I was married, Ruth continued, to a man named Carl. He wasn't a good husband. He had problems with drinking and with anger. I tried to help him, but after a while I realized I couldn't. And when I told him I was leaving, he didn't take it well. Did he threaten you? Yes, he said he would find me no matter where I went. He said I belonged to him and that if he couldn't have me, nobody could. It's why I moved here to this area. I thought I could disappear, start over. Samuel felt a familiar anger rise in his chest. He had no patience for men who hurt women. It was one of the few things that could still make him truly mad. How long ago did you leave him? 6 months ago. I've been working as a waitress in town, living in a little apartment above the diner. I thought I was safe. And your daughter? She's with my sister in another state. I couldn't take her with me until I was sure Carl couldn't find us. Samuel understood now this wasn't